Good to see everybody out this morning, especially you that are visiting. We're glad you're here. We're continuing our study this morning in the book of James. We've started in the workbook that we have in chapter 1, and we'll continue with that here in just in a few minutes. It feels kind of funny to be up here and not having the computer running and giving you guys a bunch of questions to look at before we get going. But I'm just pinch hitting today because Billy's gone, so he'll be back. Sorry.
You can test us once.
I'm going to. In fact, that's great. I'm glad you said that, Belvis, because that's exactly what I plan to do at the minute. Because as we've gotten into the book of James, okay, and we've talked about parts of chapter 1 and so forth, I want you to tell me this morning, from our study that we had in the book of Acts, what comes to your mind about James? Now, we talked about James being the brother of the Lord. And we talked about him being the author of the book that we're looking at now. But now go back to what we studied in the book of Acts. And what do we know about James?
He was an unbeliever.
Initially, you're absolutely right. What pushed him over the top?
When the Lord was crucified, I believe.
That, and then what?
Resurrection.
All right, you remember? Yes, and you remember we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 to 7, that when the Lord was, after the Lord was resurrected and he made his appearance to several and so forth, James got his own personal viewing. Now, why do you think that was necessary?
Probably no way to be.
Exactly. I think that's exactly, based on what she was just saying there a moment ago, it pushed him over the top, taking him from the unbeliever to the believer. And we get that. I mean, who would think that a brother of mine in this fleshly body would be the Lord? It just wouldn't make sense. I mean, we get that. We wouldn't. My brother is the Lord. No, can't be. That's how we'd look at it. And I think that's how James is coming across in that perspective. Now, as that takes place, then, what do we then continue to understand about James from our study in the book of Acts? Because now he transitions from non-believer to believer. And now what? What references do we refer to? There's a couple that come to mind. First of all, you remember when Peter was miraculously released from prison? The angel brings him out and so forth. When we take a look at that in Acts chapter 12, verse 17, Peter's response after he rehearses with those after that night, he says, report these to James and the brethren.
He's a servant.
I'm sorry?
He became a servant.
Absolutely he did. And a big one. I mean, because when we take a look at it, in Paul's account, and then, of course, right after Acts chapter 12, we get to Acts chapter 15, and what was that about? There's my test. Acts chapter 15, what was that about?
Wasn't a council, was it?
It is Jerusalem Conference. That's what we titled the chapter, the Jerusalem Conference. All right, now, as all that takes place, and everybody's coming together in Jerusalem to talk about the issue relative to the circumcision of the Gentiles, and the folks come up from Antioch, Paul's with them and so forth, and they meet with the brethren at Jerusalem. Who's there? All right. Now, when that meeting takes place, all right, and everybody's talking about what takes place, Peter begins, because he's the first one that goes to the Gentile converts, Acts chapter 10, correct? All right. And so Peter begins with that account and talks about all how that vision took place and how he went to Cornelius and so forth. And Barnabas and Paul are also at that meeting. And what did they present?
How they'd been with the Gentiles and they taught them.
Exactly. On all those journeys that he had been to before the meeting in Jerusalem, he talked about going to the Gentiles, presenting the word of the Lord to them, the response from them, and so forth. But then after all that's said, and all that's done, and all that makes perfect logical sense, all right, what happens?
He tells them they don't have to be circumcised.
Who tells him? Ah, that's what I'm after. That's what I'm after. Yes. James then presents it and says, okay, now based on all of this, and based on what we understand that this is the work of the Lord. I mean, we've got visions, we've got everything that's taken place here that's got God's stamp of approval on all of this. We should write a letter and state, and like you said, that they were to what? Abstain from? Okay.
Sacrifices.
Okay. And idols. And to keep yourself unspotted from the world. Adultery, that kind of thing. And that goes back to the patriarchal period of time. This wasn't something that was new. But what I want us to understand with that, as James makes that presentation, it's not something that James is just shooting from the hip from and saying we ought to write this down and send that to everybody out there. He goes back to what God had said way back in the back in the Leviticus and in the patriarchal period, and he refers to God's or ordination of things, if you will, saying of things, and he says, let's write this stuff. Let's write this down to these folks. So it's not James just winging it. It's James referring to what God would have them do. Now, what does that tell us about James?
You converted. Yeah.
Well, he is. Yes, he is. But let me back up a minute. What is James to begin with?
Jew.
He is. So he knows the background of the Jewish people. He knows the history of... Now, what his problem was, he couldn't get over the hump initially about Jesus being the Son of God and the Messiah and so forth. He struggled with that like most other Jews did too, or a lot of other Jews did too. But when he got over the top with that and he was good, then he becomes, as Peter calls him, a pillar and ground of the truth. And Paul refers to him then in Galatians chapter 2. In Paul's account of what takes place in Acts 15, he talks about James and Cephas and John being pillars of the church, which would have been referring to Jerusalem at the time. So he not only gets on board, he really gets on board. Okay? Now, with all that said, all right, what so far have we thought about in chapter 1 of James as it's been unfolded, as James has unfolded it to us? What does he initially begin to say?
Servant of God.
I'm sorry?
Servant of God.
Yes, servant of God, no question. And what's going to happen as a result? Tribulations and so forth. Do you think that rung a bell with him?
Yep.
Huh?
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, with that said like that, all right, and we take a look at what James puts together, doesn't it have a tremendous note of James has been there? James has gone down that road. James is a guy just like us. Okay, and so he writes about this, and I think verse 2 is incredibly powerful because it says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials or tribulations." Not if, not maybe, not okay, if it comes down the road, you're going to have them. It's going to happen. It happened to him. It happened to him. And so he writes this from the perspective also along with it. And I'm not taking anything away from the inspiration of the word and that type of thing. But James brings with it the experience. I've been down this road. Understand what's out here, and I want to talk to you about that kind of thing. So that's what he does. Now, with that in mind, what do we learn from it? What do we remember with things that help from this account of James and recalling about him? What comes to our mind as we reflect on temptations and trials and things like that?
We got to do the same thing.
Yeah. James is no different than us. He got 3 meals a day. Got up and down. I mean, it's just 2,000 years ago, give or take. But it's still the same. It's still the same world. It's still the same thing. So James brings that idea, that feeling of not only this coming from the Lord, but also I've been down this road and I understand this. So listen to what I'm telling you. And so he has some powerful things to say about temptation and how are we to feel about them? What does James say about that?
Count it all joy when you, I guess it's when you overcome the temptations.
And I'm sure you've got that down pat that's just not a problem. Boy, when I have a problem, I'm just eat up with, oh boy, this is wonderful. No, I don't think so. If you are, let me know your secret, because I'm not there. And I don't think any of us are. But it's the idea that we need to be looking at that way. Why?
Teaches us patience.
And boy, I am short on that suit big time. Okay? And I think a lot of us fall into that boat.
It not only teaches us patience, it also teaches to give everything to God and let Him handle it.
Yeah. And how does that most time work? It's like maybe when all else fails, I'll give it to God.
No, you have to give it to God right then and there.
Exactly. And it should be the other way around. Exactly. But we do that. Why? Why does it happen that way? Don't we like to feel like we're in control?
Yeah, we do, but we shouldn't.
Are we? But are we really?
No, we're not.
No, we're not. And that's exactly right. And he talks to that point. Exactly. And when we ask, and when we have it in our head to be thinking about God and having Him in there in our problems, how should we approach God with that? What does James say about that?
Through prayer.
Huh?
Through prayer.
Through prayer. Through prayer what? With faith. And boy, that's a big underlined exclamation point right there, because we have to have it. And, and again, it gets down to this, I've tried this, I've tried that, and it ain't working. So I'll give it to God. Like you said, it should be the other way around. And we should understand when we approach God with that, there's no doubt God can take care of this. There is just no doubt God can take care of this.
It's easy to pray, but having faith make it a little stronger.
I agree. Go ahead.
I think sometimes our prayers too, they become repetitive and habitual instead of you really putting thought into what you're even saying. You get these group of words down, you're like, you don't really think about what you're praying about sometimes.
And it's hard for and when you think about it, we have access, without a question, anytime, anywhere, any way, to the Creator of everything that we know. Anything that's out there, anything that's in this world, God created it for us. And we have access to ask Him about things about that. It's amazing. Go ahead.
What's a fervent prayer?
What is one?
I guess with faith.
Exactly. It's not doubting. It's like,
Not being double-minded.
right. What would represent double-minded to you?
Well, not believing what you're praying about,
Sort of that.
what you're asking. If you don't believe it's going to happen, why do you do it?
What does James say about it? It's pretty much worthless, isn't it?
Unstable in all his ways, or per se.
Right. So what we come away with this understanding is that in fact, in James have been in there and being there and communicating to us and to these folks and to the people that he wrote to there in verse 1, to the 12 tribes, to the dispersion abroad, to all those folks. Life ain't going to be a picnic. Okay? It's not going to be easy. And so when it is, and when these things come down your road, understand it's for your good. And I'll tell you, unless you guys have got a better angle on this than me, that's hard to see. When you're in the thick of things that are going on that's not good, to understand that it's for my good, that gets tough. That gets tough because life deals some pretty wicked blows, and sometimes they're pretty tough. And so we need to understand that God's there. We've got access to him. We have to let him know that we're genuinely concerned about this, and we want to let him know what's on our mind, and he'll be there. He'll be there. I mean, the verse that points out, verse 5, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. Again, think about it. When do we do that? When all else fails. When all else fails, then we'll ask God. We should have it the other way around.
Do it first.
Exactly. Do it first and let God know what's on our mind. I know, dealt with things that we didn't know exactly how to deal with, but we took it on anyway. Okay? Somehow we made it through it. We asked God through it before. A lot of things straighten out before we get there. That's just good thoughts. All right, so as we got down through what we were working on Wednesday evening, we got down through, I think, that question, what is that, 2? Yeah, where it's talking about the idea of God has begat us through all these things that have worked out. Every good and perfect gift comes down from above, coming down from the Father of lights, verse 17, with whom there's no variation or shadow of turning. We look at that and we just have to be in awe of how God provides so many things for us. But how does, and we talked about this Wednesday night, in what James is talking about here, how has God begotten us? And we talked about what that word meant as brought forth. Okay? How has he done that?
Through his word.
And so when we understand his word is so powerful. And that's why I wanted to begin this class this morning and tying things together. Because we look at so many things in the New Testament as segments and books and chapters and verses. And they are, okay? But we don't tie them together. And that's why I wanted to go back and see, when you understand where James has come from, and then start to understand what he writes, it has a whole different feel to it. Paul does the same thing 13 times if he wrote Hebrews. 13 times after the book of Acts, he writes Romans all on through, and it's because he's been there. He has the experience. He brings things to it. We look at the book of Galatians, and the first shot out of the box, as far as Paul is concerned, is how come you're leaving what I told you? Chapter 1.
And also by obeying his word too.
True. And so as Paul reflects on these kinds, he'd been through Galatia 3 times. Okay? He'd gone through there and visited those churches 3 times. He knew what those people were being hit with. And so he speaks to it. And because we know he's been there, and because we know that in Lystra's, where he was stoned and left for dead, we know he knows what the caliber of those people can be. And so it helps us get a clearer vision and a clearer picture of what the rest of the New Testament's trying to tell us. Because we can understand where the author has been and what he's going through, and helps us to fill in the blanks. And I get why he's saying that. Okay, James is in that same situation, coming at it from a little different angle, but James has got the experience, and so he's writing and letting us know that. So as we're brought forth, we become the first fruits of God's creation. Can we ever try to get a feel for what that really is like? The creator of everything we know, all right, has given us the roadmap that gets from here to where he's at. Can we really, really appreciate what that really means? And I don't think we do at times. I don't think we do. I don't think we have the real feeling of just how good we have it. Okay? How good we have it compared to people from years past, compared to people that have died for this. Okay? And how good we have it to be able to sit here this morning in a warm building and understand how powerful God is and what He's given to us through the pages of His Word. So we're the first fruits of His creation, just like James is talking about here. The Word has touched us. The Word has got us to this point, and we're getting better and better with it. Or that should be our goal.
Yes.
That should be our goal, to be better and better with it as things develop. All right, so I think we got down through about verse 18, because what we want to take a look at is that as James talks about all the things that happens and talks about trials and tribulations and how we need to endure and what will happen when we do. Verse 12, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those that love Him. It's not just James saying, okay, I'm telling you this for no meaning. There's a meaning here. Okay, I'm telling you this because if you hang in there and you follow what's going on, the long benefit is going to be heaven. That's the benefit that will happen. And so as he gets down here then, and we get to starting in verse 19, he starts in dealings with some things to help us deal with everyday stuff. He's already set the stage as, hey, tribulation is going to hit. It's going to happen. Okay? All right, now he says, look at verse 19. And this you know, my brethren, but let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Now, has everybody got that down pat? As Mom and Dad used to tell me, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth, that ought to tell you something. You need to be listening twice as much as you're talking. Okay? That's where James is going with this and saying it another way. Okay? Everybody should be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Do you see the progression of how it works? Because as it gets progressively hotter, as I get progressively hotter, okay, I get progressively worse. Go ahead.
I think we kind of got that reversed. We're quick to anger and quick to wrath.
Exactly. I think in a heartbeat. I mean, we can flip a switch and we're detonated right there. Go ahead. Am I missing somebody? Okay. So as he and I took a look at this and trying to just see a progression of things, and I think one of the best illustrations of this principle, if we go clear back to Genesis, let's take a look at Genesis chapter 4. If you recall the account of Cain and Abel, and recall the situation that was going on there, we know Cain killed Abel and so forth. But before that takes place, there's a progression here that the Lord gives us that I think pretty much tells us how things go. All right? Because as God is having this conversation with Cain in verse 6, he says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? And countenance just means you got a bad expression on your face. Everybody knows by looking you're hot. You're mad. Okay? That's what he's talking about. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? If you're doing good, you got a good expression on your face, okay? But if you do not well, watch what takes place here. Watch the progression. If you do not well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, and you must master it. Verse 6. Okay, verse 7, I'm sorry. See the progression? If we don't keep it under control, if we don't rein it in and say, ooh, I'm not going to go there, it's a progression. And what happened to Cain? He killed his brother. He killed his brother. So there's a progression of things that James says in another way. And like Arvel said just a minute ago, a lot of times we got it backwards. Okay? But he says, let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. I don't know about you, but that's hard for me to get a hold of
Well,
because we're not, yeah. Go
we've
ahead.
been in church a long time, we should be able to do that, and accomplish some of that shit.
Yeah, how you got a handle on it? You got a good recipe on it? We want to know it if you do.
What he says,
we want to know it if you got it.
slow to speak,
Yeah.
slow to write,
Yeah.
and quick to hear, that'll do it.
It'll do it. But it's the implementing of it for that's difficult. And I think we're all in that boat. But James says, progression of things here.
You know,
It's
it says where there is good, evil is always present.
you got it. You got it. That's right.
Galatians says for us to grow in that, don't he?
Growing.
Growing, not being angry, sinning, and all that.
And that I don't know about you, but that's a lifetime assignment to get better with it. I mean, to work, but it's the work that's involved. And James talks about this because he's going to give a lot of attention in this book relative to our tongue, to the use of it, what we say, what we do. And he's already got the groundwork laid right here in this verse. Listen, keep your mouth shut, and don't get hot.
Right.
And don't get hot. And again, that's not an easy thing to do. Because verse 20 it says, "For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." And I think if we could keep that point in our thoughts, a lot of other things would focus better. When I'm in this state, when I'm unglued, when I'm coming apart because I'm angry, my righteousness as far as God is concerned isn't there. It isn't there. Go ahead.
And I think maybe what Dad was trying to say is like, if 40 years ago I was saying I need to work on my anger because I don't have it mastered, and I'm still 40 years later saying, well, I need to work on this, maybe we need to look at the recipe again or ourselves and say,
Good point.
I need to.
Good point. That's why I wanted him to write down his list and show us how to do it, because that sounds really good. I like it. Go ahead.
One thing that helps me, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay.
Yeah.
And I always try my hard best to remember that.
I agree. That's good stuff. I mean, and I think along that same line, it's those kinds of things that works for you. Okay. When a verse comes to mind, and we talked about that in some of the other studies here, when God's word comes to mind to help us keep our mouth shut, or help us to not get angry, whatever, that's the begatting, if you will, that we talked about here. God's word working to help us do that. To help us do that. Go ahead.
He also says to be angry and sin not.
Mm-hmm. That's we get into that. We talk about that, and that's good. I mean that's exactly where it needs to be. But a lot of times when we get it to that point, as we read about with Cain, the next step is not good. Go ahead.
It also says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath.
Exactly, and that's again that can be tough, as you know. Go ahead.
He was talking about when you do good, sin is always present.
Mhm.
The devil. Well, I had a incident that me and my daughter was listening to a tape on anger.
Mm-hmm.
And we was at a car wash. And I said, that is not my problem. I really don't have a problem with anger. And about that time, the car, we was in a long line. And a car coming running right in front of me. And I got so angry. I just wanted to throw that tape at him.
Yeah. So you need to read this. We've all been there. That's what we've all had that kind of stuff happen. I told a lot of, now down here it's not as often as you see it in Cincinnati. I mean, if you want to keep anger under control, don't get out in rush hour in traffic, because that's not where you want to be to try to control anger. Because, I've told a lot of people, I said, what did you say the last time you just got cut off out here on the interstate? And you get these expressions on people's face. Oh yeah, I know what that's about. You know, and it's like what you're talking about. You know, like we've all been there, and we all need to work on that. Go ahead.
You know, Christ, he got angry when he went into the temple
Mm-hmm.
and they were gambling and all this and that.
Yes.
And he tore the tables down, turned the chambers, the money over and everything.
Yes.
But we will get angry.
He didn't
Mhm.
sin, though.
There's no way to stop it.
And you, go ahead.
But we can stop it, but we may not stop it right then.
Right.
We get better as we go along.
And you bring up a great point because he deals with this in some respects. There's a difference in anger, is there not, between righteous anger
Yeah.
and just anger because you got messed up in the car wash? you know that isn't there a difference? I mean, the Lord was upset because of what took place in the temple with the exchange of money and what was going on. It wasn't the purpose of what the building was, what was supposed to be happening there. Okay? And so he fixed it. Okay? And he took care of that. Now, I don't know how you fix a car wash deal. You know, I don't know how you do that. Okay?
I learned from the experience.
There you go. There you go. All right. But the point is, when we're angry because of something that's not right in terms of God's work, you know, that's a different anger. That's a righteous anger because things. Now, if you want to, I mean, we could be that angry every day long just by listening to the news every day. Okay, but my point is, as your account was there, it can be done. It can be an anger like that takes care of things and corrects things for God, and it's okay. Okay. But the other part, that's all things that we all have to fight. Go ahead.
That's like if somebody's teaching the wrong thing, we know it. It should make us angry.
Yes,
But there's a right way to handle it.
there's a right way to handle it. You bet. You bet. And I think that gets into some of the things that we're reading here in verse 19. The idea of being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. We can put that equation in that order. We can hear things like what you're talking about here, and you just want to go get somebody because of what they're saying. But that's not normally not the right way to handle a situation. But it gives you time to think. It gives you time to think about how is the best way to do this, still to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, but you've thought through it enough to be able to say what needs to be done in the right kind of way to achieve what needs to happen. Good point. Great point. Great point. Okay, because when we talked about this in terms of some of these questions, let's look at the questions here. We've already talked about 1 and 2. How should we be about our hearing? And we've said quick to hear. Number 2, what 2 things should we be slow? Speaking and in anger. Okay, all right. And then in verse number 3, why should we be slow to wrath? And talked about in verse 20.
Does not produce the righteousness of God.
Right. There you go. And that's the verse 20 that is the part. And you read these two together, and it helps us get the clear picture. Because when we do these first 3 things, if they're not in the right sequence and in the right order, then verse 20, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. And that's a big picture. That's as powerful as vengeance is mine, says the Lord. You know, I'll take care of it. Go ahead.
We like to use the blame game.
Okay.
Blame someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Blame, well, that guy did it. He made me mad. Now they're doing commercials on TV.
Mm-hmm.
Like you got a cold, you mess up. That cold made me do it.
Yeah.
So
It goes all the way back.
it's easy to blame someone else.
Goes all the way back to Adam and Eve.
Right.
She said the same thing.
Take the credit. Give yourself the credit.
That's
Because you got angry.
right. Exactly. And on any given day, that can change.
Yes.
Some days can be better than others along that line. Okay. All right, and I think we kind of hit on this one in 3a. Does this mean that anger does not help one to do God's will? How did you answer that? He wants a yes or a no, I think.
I bet yes.
Yes.
I put both. I put both. Go ahead.
I think it can.
Hmm?
I think it can help you. If you get mad at some of these preachers that are preaching false doctrine, you might get up enough nerve to go talk to that preacher
Right.
about what he's teaching.
But you probably couldn't talk to him right if you.
Well, you got there.
Okay, okay.
One thing for certain, he won't be talking to you right.
Right? Good point. That's why I answered it yes or no, because it could go down both directions. But normally, yes, it can help us be better with that. And we've already touched on Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26 in our conversation this morning, because it talks about where Paul is talking about being angry, and he says, "And do not sin when angry." That's tough. I'm telling you, because by the time you get to the button that's pushed that says I'm hot, there's a lot of things that go out of control. Most of the time it's my mouth, right? You know, most of the time it's that. And of course James is going to give a lot of attention to that and so forth. So let's just stop there. Well, we got one more there on B. It said, are there some sins that may be committed because of anger? I mean, what are some sins that can be committed because of anger? I'm sorry.
Murder.
Murder, cursing.
Violence with words.
Okay. All what you're saying basically reflects around what? Me running my mouth.
Right.
And most of the time I'm saying something that shouldn't be said.
Quick to speak.
Quick to, there you go. There you go. Quick to speak. All right. Well, let's stop right there. We'll let Billy start up with that. Our time's up this morning. Appreciate your help. It's a good class this morning. You guys taught a good one. I appreciate it. Thank you.